All right, we're good. So tonight, we're excited that we have Steve Paisley on to do the digestive work or lecture. From this lecture, we have this one, and then we also, and I'll tell you, but now and I'll remind you, is that we also have a lecture next Tuesday night too. So put that on your calendar and make sure that you get that written down for the harvesting workshop with Laura Means. But with that, I'm going to let Steve introduce himself. We're excited to have him. This is his second year with us, so he did a lecture for you guys that were in the class last year, is that you had the opportunity to listen to him last year. I know that quite a few of you guys that are on tonight are new, and so it might be the first time for you meeting Steve. And so I'm going to let him introduce himself. He can tell you exactly what he does within the university system, and he has a dual appointment as far as between Extension and the College of Ag, and so I'll let him explain that with you. And before I turn that over to him, I just seen that Allison came on. Allison, are you good? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So make sure you put your name, full first and last name and county in the chat box. If you guys don't know where that chat box is, it's at the bottom. You can just click on the chat box and then send it to me. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Steve and let him introduce himself and let him get going.
Thank you, Donna. I appreciate it. I'm glad to have the chance to visit with everybody tonight. As Dawn mentioned, I'm going to talk about digestive systems with all farm animals, essentially, and so we're going to go through all of those. A little background on myself: I'm the Extension Beef Specialist, or the State Beef Specialist. I'm actually not located on campus. I have an office, a research station. Appointment here, help as a part of the director out here at Lingle. I also have an extension appointment as statewide beef specialist, and I'm teaching the senior beef production class in animal science in Army as well. So a chance to learn me quite a bit as well. So look forward to this. 3 kids that have all been in 4-H. My oldest is graduated now and at UW, but we're big 4-H members and continue to do that. So I'm going to turn this over and I'll click on my slides here. Hopefully I can share my slides and get started. So again, as we mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about not just on beef cattle, on all farm species, and kind of, I think it's important to understand a lot of this as far as how you manage your cattle or your sheep or your pigs or your chickens or your rabbits. Having a better understanding of their digestive system is important, and knowing maybe how to avoid problems, how to avoid mistakes and feeding mistakes, and how to recognize maybe if there is a problem, and I guess just general understanding of how to optimize and help your animal gain and be at the market weight that you want when you get fair. So we're going to talk about animal digestion, and hopefully things will work all right here. And I guess, Dawn, if so, let me know. So again, our objectives are kind of twofold. We want to talk a little bit about and identify the different types of digestive systems with our farm animals. Hopefully I'll make it a little bit fun, and we'll talk about some of the other species and other animals that are out there as well, and maybe how they tie into all of this. And then also identify those major parts of the digestive system and kind of describe their functions, again with the idea that understanding how digestion works in your specific animal might help you do a better job of feeding, or recognize how to improve digestion, improve weight gain in your animals, and how to avoid problems. So that's kind of where we're at today. Hopefully we'll get some of this accomplished. So if you think about digestion in general, what we're trying to do is take that feed, whatever feed we're delivering there, try to reduce it down and break it down into smaller particles that can be utilized and absorbed from the blood and utilized in building tissue, weight gain in your animal, or maintenance in your animal for that matter. So it involves mechanical breakdown of food, and we'll kind of go through that in the different species. There's also chemical breakdown, obviously. We'll talk about some of the different enzymes, different acids, some of the different things that are produced by not only bacteria but by the animal, and helping break down the feed as well. And then we'll talk about how certainly contractions and different movements within the digestive tract help and aid in digestion as well. So all three of those are a part of digestion. So if we think about animals, we can classify them in a lot of different ways. Certainly even farm animals we can classify differently. So you could classify cattle or pigs or whatever we're talking about. I'm going to slip up all night. I'll warn you right now because I'm the beef specialist, and so I immediately refer to animals and immediately think of cattle, and I'm going to slip up a bunch of times tonight because I'm going to inadvertently say cattle every single time, just because that's my area of emphasis. But hopefully we'll cover a lot of different species here. So if you think about what feeds or what foods those animals eat, we can categorize or classify those as well. So obviously a carnivore are animals that select predominantly animal products. Herbivores such as cattle, goats, and sheep and horses are animals that again prefer or select plants. And then we certainly have omnivores, and we think predominantly of ourselves as well as pigs that can select or utilize both animal and plant products as well. So we could classify animals and group them, categorize them by what type of foods they eat. Obviously, that's one way to do it. And certainly another way is to kind of classify or organize them by their digestive system. And there are some big differences in digestive system, and that's kind of what we hope to talk about tonight. We can really kind of break them down into about 3 or 4 different categories. Certainly, when we think about a lot of our farm animals, we can break them down into monogastrics, those animals that have a simple stomach, and we'll go through those tonight. Those are probably the simplest digestive tract is those of pigs, relatively simple as compared to the other species. We're going to talk about another one that we call cecal or hindgut fermenters, and that's horses and rabbits, those animals that actually have a simple stomach first and then feed, and fiber, especially plant products, are broken down after the stomach in the cecum or in the large intestine. And then the other one is articulated stomachs. We probably don't run into that much in our world, but that's essentially kangaroos and some of the old world monkeys and basically those animals that have relatively simple stomachs to try and utilize plant-based products or something that has fiber that they want to try and break down. So those are simple stomachs. We'll talk about those tonight. And then we have ruminant species. We want to generally or categorize them as multiple compartmental stomachs. So many of them have 4-chambered stomachs. A lot of the livestock species that we deal with, cattle, sheep, and goats, have 4 chambers. Though we do have some species that have 3-chambered stomachs, so a little bit different design, and we'll talk about those. Now, we talk tonight, and you'll see in textbooks and in different reading, some textbooks call 3-chambered stomachs as pseudo-ruminants. But I've also seen horses or cecal fermenters or hindgut fermenters described as pseudo-ruminants, mainly from the standpoint that they break down forages and hays much like a ruminant animal. But we're going to try and keep those separate. I'm going to refer to horses as cecal or hindgut fermenters, and we'll talk about 3-chambered stomachs more as modified ruminants a little bit later on. So anyway, we can break things down by their digestive system, and we'll kind of walk through those over the next hour or so, and hopefully it kind of makes sense why we worry about certain things in different species. All right, so you think about how critical it is to kind of understand the digestive system. It's pretty important because it actually helps us understand what occurs where in the digestive process. When is food broken down? When do we need to worry about big changes in feed intake? A lot of times when we talk about raising livestock animals, we talk about the importance of providing clean water, which is critical for all species, regardless of what their digestive system is. But we also talk about what types of feed we give. We talk about how to not make abrupt or quick changes in diets, and we'll kind of hit on the reasons for that as well. But also timeliness and when we feed, right? So we want to be accurate in the amount of feed we deliver every day. We also want to be timely or consistent when we deliver and provide feed twice a day or whatever we're doing make sure we're very consistent in that, because animals really rely on that. Consistency is really important for the health of the animal, for normal digestive function, and we'll kind of hit on those things as we go. All right, 2 things to think about. It may show up in your quiz. So to think about, certainly digestion. Digestion itself is breaking down that food into simple substances that can be absorbed by the body. So that's digestion. Absorption is where we absorb that or move those particles or those nutrients across the membrane into the bloodstream and utilized by that animal. So digestion is where we break that feed down into usable pieces. Absorption is where we absorb it into the animal and utilize that through our different tissues in our body. So digestion and absorption, 2 different things. Both are critical in turning feed into tissue growth or tissue maintenance in the animal. All right. So, and we'll talk about these. This is just kind of a general, kind of try and set us up for what we're going to hit on later. But again, the digestive system are all of those parts that are involved with breaking down that food and helping us to digest that food. So it's not only the mechanical processes of chewing the food, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's the peristaltic or the muscle contractions that help move the food through our digestive system. And it's also the enzymes, the secretions, the acids, and the saliva, those types of things, those chemical processes that help break it down as well. And these all occur in different parts or in different points depending on the type of digestive system the animal has. And again, we're going to kind of break this down. I kind of color-coded it. Hopefully that will kind of help us keep on track to what we're talking about. But we think about monogastric animals such as pigs and humans, ruminant animals, hindgut fermenters, or again, sometimes those are called pseudo-ruminants. We're going to focus on trying to call them hindgut fermenters or cecal fermenters, and then the avian species or birds. So we'll kind of hit on all of those things relatively quickly, again with the idea of trying to understand how food is broken down differently in those species, and that kind of helps us address how to feed animals, what to recognize, how to manage animals differently. All right, so the simplest one, we'll kind of start with that first, the monogastric species. Again, that's just a single chambered stomach, again, that we think about. The stomach is, again, a muscular organ that helps and stores food as well as digests the food and breaks it down through contractions of the stomach. That's what takes the food and moves it on down the line into the small intestine. So very simple. Stomach is kind of where we'll start. Again, pigs are the perfect example. Dogs, cats are all monogastric, are simple stomached animals. Again, that kind of starts, we'll get into this a little bit later, but just to think about it, when we talk about the simple stomach, that stomach is kind of defined by using acid, predominantly hydrochloric acid, but using acid to help begin the breakdown process of those feeds. So the stomach part in every species is basically the same idea, where we get enzymes and we get acids put into the stomach. In the case of the stomach, it's very acidic. So if you think about a normal or a pH that is like drinking water that's relatively normal is pH of 7. Things that are acidic are low numbers or lower numbers. We see a pH of the stomach of 1.5 to 2.5, so a very acidic environment. Again, that animal is using that as a way to denature proteins, as a way to break down feeds into smaller usable pieces, and that's one of the processes. The acidic part of this always takes place in the stomach, and we'll talk about how that changes in as far as the order in different species. But that's the thing to remember about that. Animals with this type of digestive system, they're typically better to adapted to use concentrated feeds such as grains, and they typically do not handle roughages very well, just plain monogastrics. That's why we use soybean meal and corn, basically plant-based proteins, starches and sugars, those types of things in our pigs, because again, they're not set up to break down fiber. They can't break down coarse roughage material. Sometimes maybe they want to nibble on it, or they'll have a little bit of it in their diet just to maintain good digestive health. But for the most part, we're going to focus on feeding those animals concentrates just because of the makeup of their digestive system. So just a basic diagram, if you think about the simple monogastric animal, again, just the simple esophagus, so the animal eats through the mouth, chews. We'll talk about the chewing action in a little bit later. But again, the esophagus goes directly into the stomach. The stomach, that's where we get the acid to help break down those different particles into smaller pieces. So again, in a very simple system, you've got a simple stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and out the animal. So we'll talk about the importance of that later on. But again, that's kind of the simplest of all of these. All right. Next one, we'll talk a little bit about our cecal or hind gut fermenters. And these are animals that do tend to eat large amounts of roughages, much like a cow, much like a ruminant, but they don't have the same complex stomach that a ruminant animal has. And we'll kind of focus on that. So really, they're set up differently. To some extent, they're almost opposite of cattle to some extent because, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But again, this is kind of a unique digestive system. It does a lot of the same things as a ruminant animal because they do tend to utilize the same type of feeds, the same type of grasses as ruminant animals. But to some extent, it's almost flip-flopped, right? And we'll talk about that. So if we think about hindgut fermenters, they can utilize a lot of roughage, and that's mainly because that's digested in the large intestine. So they appear somewhat normal, or they would be somewhat similar to a monogastric. They have a simple stomach, they've got a small intestine, but again, all of that feed passes through the stomach, passes through the small intestine, largely undigested, especially fiber or roughages, pass through the stomach, pass through the small intestine because they don't have the bacteria to break them down in that area. So again, those fibers will pass right on down through, and they're collected in the hindgut or in the cecum where that fermentation takes place. So one way to think about it a little bit is if you think about a cow having a rumen, the cecum of the horse, or the large intestine of the horse, I guess works mechanically very much like the rumen of a cow. That's where the fermentation takes place. That's where the bacteria and protozoa exist. The bacteria are in protozoa and fungi. Those microscopic organisms are what breaks those fibers down. We don't have the ability to do it ourselves. That's where we rely on those microbes to break those products down. So the interesting thing, though, is it's on the other end of the horse, right? So in a horse, we have colic, right? And colic is where you get digestive upset in the colon. You don't have bloat in a horse, or so it's on the other, basically on the other end of the horse. So again, that's some of the things to think about, how we manage these animals and what works better from a management or to alleviate some of the problems in these animals. So again, examples of hindgut fermenters are horses, obviously, but rabbits and guinea pigs and hamsters are also similar to those. So those are all hindgut fermenters, all right? So there's just a picture of a rabbit. We'll show you a horse in a minute as well. But again, the idea, all of the feed goes in through the esophagus. It goes into a simple stomach. Everything's the same as a monogastric here. Goes through the small intestine, and then all of that fermentation takes place, secondary fermentation takes place in the cecum. So the cecum is acting as the fermentation area in these animals, the hindgut fermenters. So again, that's what we see there. Rabbits are this way. You see most of this fermentation takes place in the large intestine and the cecum. So again, that's hard to digest. That's why we rely on the microbes. And so a lot of this plant material passes all the way through until it gets to that area and is broken down. So that's where the cellulose and the fiber is broken down in the cecum and large intestine. So if you think about a rabbit and managing rabbits, maybe some of you have rabbits as projects. Rabbits passes two types of pellets, and so they have hard droppings and soft or black pellets. So if you think about a rabbit cage, a lot of times a rabbit cage will have a perforated floor from a cleanliness standpoint, but a lot of times they will also have an area that's a solid floor to where it allows that animal to go back, and they will actually go back and eat those night droppings to help improve the digestion of those roughages. So in other words, because of their makeup, they don't necessarily always get 100% utilization out of that grass or alfalfa or that forage that we feed those animals. So they actually go through a second fermentation. I think of it almost from the standpoint like a cow regurgitates, or they burp up a bolus and remasticate it and rechew it and swallow it back down. Very much like that in cattle. However, rabbits on the other end, because their fermentation happens on the other end, not on the mouth end, but the rear end, they can go back in, re-ingest those pellets, very much like a cow chews or cud, and get better utilization out of those forages in that case. So those pellets are actually relatively high in value, energy value, and it's important for those animals. All right, here's a picture of a horse. Again, the idea, the esophagus is very much the same. A small intestine is very much the same as a monogastric, but again, you have a very large cecum and a very large small intestine. Again, that's where all the fermentation takes place. So that's where you have problems with colic when you have abrupt diet changes with the horse. It's not on the front end because all of that feed is digested. It's not fermented in the stomach. All of that feed passes through the stomach, passes through the small intestine, and that feed is then broken down and fermented in the large intestine and in the cecum. So again, all of that passes through, and when you do abrupt diet changes, that really affects those microbial populations on the other end, and that's where you can develop colic. So if they go in and change diets rapidly, or they get too much grain all at once, or we switch diets too fast, it's not affecting the front end, it's affecting that fermentation in the cecum and large intestine, and that's where we run into colic. All right, so horses are kind of unique, and certainly, although they can utilize the same feeds as cattle, they go about it a different way. All right, so the other one, this is maybe more trivia than it is important from a farm animal standpoint, but there are species that have what we call sacculated stomachs. So they utilize, these are for old world monkeys, much like baboons, as well as and other omnivores. Kangaroos also are sacculated stomachs. So they're not exactly a ruminant animal, but they do have an enlarged stomach. There is some bacterial degradation or some bacteria that reside in the stomach that help break down some of this fiber. Again, they're not as efficient as ruminant animals, but they're kind of the transition, I guess, is how I think of them. Those animals have a divided stomach. There is some fermentation that takes place, but they're not to the extreme or not developed to the point as a ruminant animal. All right. Okay, so one more again. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about avian species. Again, this is considerably different, obviously, than monogastrics or ruminants or hindgut fermenters. Quite a bit different. Since a bird actually has no teeth, they've developed some additional organs to help break some of this down. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think you probably, it's important to kind of understand these parts, especially anatomically in chickens, and why they serve a role. So I guess from the standpoint, esophagus is again the same across species. However, in the chicken, the first thing they have is what we call a crop. And for those of you that have the great benefit of growing up as I did and cleaning chickens every spring, you got to dress chickens, and you would run across these. The crop is actually just a large tissue, a large sac that actually kind of holds the feed. It basically allows it to soak, allows it to absorb moisture. It softens it and helps that animal break it down. Again, because a bird does not have teeth, they've got a beak, obviously, but not a lot of chewing action happens in the mouth. It's swallowed, it's softened, and it's held in the crop for a while. The next place it moves into is down through and into the gizzard, which the gizzard is actually a very strong muscle, and so we think about that. That's some, I guess, I grew up, that was a delicacy. You got got to eat the gizzard. But again, it's a very strong muscle. It's a very tough muscle, and it acts much like that chewing action. So it moves and contracts and relaxes and contracts and relaxes. And it actually typically birds will eat some gravel, some hard objects. Those reside in the gizzard. And so that mechanical action will actually break those down much like chewing would be in the animal. So again, passes on through there, into there. From the gallbladder, it goes basically into what would be somewhat the original stomach, small intestine, and then on out the bird. Keep in mind, I'm not going to focus a lot on this, but keep in mind it's a much more rapid digestion as compared to other species. So it moves through the animal relatively quickly as compared to ruminants and monogastrics. All right, so the crop is where the food is stored and soaked. From the crop, it makes its way to the gizzard. The gizzard, again, normally contains some type of grit that helps break those particles down into smaller size. And again, it is digested pretty rapidly. All right, so there's a number of organisms, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, I guess, but certainly a lot of different organs play a role in this as well. It's not just the structures, but also a lot of different organs that help provide that enzymatic breakdown as well as all of those things. So, all right, so there's avians. We'll move on now, and I'm kind of looking at the time, and I realize we're trying to hold this to about an hour. So we're going to talk about the ruminant side. Now, again, that's my specialty, and so I'm probably going to spend way too much time on ruminant animals. But again, I think that's probably, from Wyoming standpoint, an important species when you think about how much grass, how much forage, and how much grazing and grazable acres we have in Wyoming. This is predominantly why we have a lot of ruminant animals, whether it's sheep or cattle or even to some extent goats. Pretty important species for us and for our Wyoming economy. And again, the idea of ruminant animal is defined as a compartmentalized stomach that's really specialized or really unique. Again, typically from a domestic standpoint, cattle, sheep, and goats are the ones we typically think about. Because of its a complex diet, or it's a complex structure, we can really get the maximum utilization out of roughages. So again, a lot of those roughages can be broken down and utilized in this animal. So we'll kind of go through the steps from a ruminant animal standpoint and how that works. And so here's just kind of a cartoon drawing of cow. And as you guys probably all known through your science classes and through FFA and other things that you've been involved with, we all know the four compartments of the ruminant animal. And we'll go through those kind of by order. But again, it's relatively large. It's considerably larger than the other species, and again, it's a very large fermentation vat, again with the idea of utilizing forages, and really that's the ruminant animal specialty. How can we break down big plant species, grasses that are high in cellulose, that are high in fiber? Again, normal animals do not contain the enzymes to break those down on their own. That's where we rely on that fermentation, that relationship with microbes, a relationship with bacteria to break the fiber down, to break the cellulose down into usable pieces that can be absorbed by the animal. All right. So again, the rumen is the largest section of that stomach. It accounts for about 60% of the entire stomach. And again, that's where that fermentation vat is. And keep in mind, much like we talked about with rabbits, part of the mechanical breakdown of grasses, because they do have a lot of fiber, they do have a lot of cellulose, they break down slowly. Part of that mechanical breakdown is the ability in cattle and the ability in ruminants to regurgitate boluses back up, to rechew those, and to swallow them back down again. So here we'll kind of walk through the different parts. Again, remember, the rumen is part of that. Again, we'll talk about the characterizations here in a minute, but again, that big, large fermentation vat. Remember, about 60% of the size of the ruminant animal's complex or stomach is 60% of that is rumen. It's called the punch, or a slang term or another term for it. This is just kind of a picture of it. And if you look at it, it looks almost like a towel or a blanket. It's got a lot, or like I always think of it a little bit like a latch hook rug. or something like that, because it's got a lot of what we call papillae, a lot of little cilia. So what that animal is trying to do is to maximize the surface area. So those are all little individual bumps or in that animal, and what it's trying to do is create more surface area, more area for the animal to absorb nutrients, more area for things to happen. And so in a healthy rumen, you have an animal that has all of these, this is kind of a microscopic view of it, all of these little individual bumps on the inside of there. And so that's a very healthy rumen that's got a lot of those individual bumps. Again, the idea being it's more ability to absorb nutrients, more ability to interact with that feed. So the next, and we typically kind of categorize or group these two together. Reticulum is the next area, and again, that's the second segment of the stomach. It's kind of usually considered an extension of the rumen because it's not necessarily completely separated. It's basically a large area that nutrients and feed flows back and forth between these two. It has more of a honeycomb type of ridges in it, and I'll show you some pictures of it in a minute. It really aids in keeping the fluid and rumen mixed, so there are more muscular contractions in the reticulum. If you think about it, it's kind of like on a baster or on like a syringe. That's that big bulb on the end that you squeeze, and that really causes the circulation or causes that feed to move around in the rumen. So again, it's kind of the area on the front or on the closer to the head. Again, that causes those contractions, causes a lot of movement, a lot of circulation of the food. Again, once the right consistency is achieved, it then passes on through the reticulum. All right, so one of the problems, or what we can run into sometimes with the reticulum, is because of that shape, because of that honeycomb structure in it, it tends to collect objects that are ingested by the animal that really shouldn't be there. So a lot of times we worry about so we call it hardware disease, right? So that animal inadvertently swallows, whether it's maybe baling wire in the bale, or they swallow a screw or a piece of metal that's in the feed that they inadvertently swallow. A lot of times it will collect in the reticulum. And so in many cases we place magnets inside, especially dairy animals that eat a huge volume of feed and are fed a lot of harvested feeds, a lot of mechanically harvested feeds. We'll put magnets in them because we want to collect those. So we call it hardware disease, but essentially what can happen is, if you think about the reticulum, it's a big muscular tissue that contracts and expands and allows and moves things around. Well, in the process of contraction and relaxing and contracting and relaxing, if we have metal in there, especially if it's sharp metal like baling wire or something like that, those contractions and relaxation, that can actually cause the wire to migrate or work its way through the membrane or through the rumen wall or the reticulum wall. And so that's bad in itself. It can cause infection in the animal. That's a concern. But interestingly enough, the thing right next to the reticulum is the heart and the peritoneum, so if something migrates through the reticulum wall, chances are it's very close proximity to the heart. So we'll see animals that can get very sick from hardware disease, and a lot of times it's because some type of metal has migrated through the reticulum and now is in the body cavity near the heart. It can cause infection, it can cause damage to the heart, these types of things. So a lot of times we'll put magnets in dairy cows, cows that eat a lot of harvested forage, as ways to prevent that. So basically what the animal will eventually do, if they can compartmentalize it, they will kind of wall it off, and they'll hopefully reduce the severity or reduce the chance of that hurting the animal. So that's a lot of times why we're concerned about what's in the feed bunk. We'll check, make sure the feed bunk's clean, make sure there aren't a lot of loose wires or nails or screws. We want to make sure we get those, because that animal may inadvertently swallow or eat those things, and it can cause major problems. All right, so here's a picture of the reticulum. For those of you that like to eat tripe or menudo, this is the part of the stomach that's used for that. And again, we call it the honeycomb just because the appearance of that, it looks very much like a honeycomb. All right, we're moving on. Again, I realize I'm dragging down here. We want to kind of keep moving things along. All right, so we've talked about the first two, reticulorumen, or the rumen and the reticulum. The next one is what we call the omasum. Omasum is basically a smaller compartment that the main reason for that is that that's the main site for water absorption. So we're trying to, just because of the huge amount of volume, the huge amount of water in the rumen, we start to try and remove that to improve absorption and utilization on throughout the rest of the digestive tract. So basically, it's much like a sieve. It takes in products. It tries to allow some of that, the smaller products or the smaller particles, go through on into the rest of the digestive system. So it's basically a filter or a sieve, the way to kind of control that. All right, so here's a picture of it. We call it the mini plies. But again, if you think about that kind of like a furnace filter or an air filter on your car, right? So it's got a lot of different folds in it, a lot of different surface area to collect the larger particles, hold them back, and allow the smaller particles on down the line, right? So that's kind of what we think of the omasum. All right, so we've talked about those, and really from a standpoint of a ruminant animal, those three compartments, the reticulum, the rumen, and the omasum, we refer to those all as forestomachs. So they're basically structures that exist before the true stomach. So at this point, ruminant animals are incredibly unique. They have these three forestomach structures, reticulum, rumen, and omasum, that are very unique compared to anything else. The abomasum, which is the fourth compartment, the abomasum is very much like the true stomach of a monogastric. That's where, if we think about it, that's where the acid is introduced. That's where the normal enzymatic breakdown happens, very much like a monogastric. So that's kind of where the transition happens. These three compartments up here are very unique to ruminant species. That's where all the fermentation takes place. All right, so if we think about that reticulorumen, or that big fermentation vat, it's basically filled with bacteria and protozoa, to some extent some fungi as well, although much smaller in number. So those are microbes or unicellular or one-celled organisms that really help us break these things down. They're basically fibrolytic bacteria. Those are fibrolytic enzymes, fibrolytic bacteria that secrete enzymes that break down structural carbohydrates. So if we think about plants, what gives them the ability to stand upright, to have a stalk, to have a stem that fights off gravity and stands up vertically, those are structural components in that plant that we typically think of as cellulose and hemicellulose. They're very much necessary for that plant to grow vertically, because if it didn't have cellulose and hemicellulose, it would just lay flat on the ground like a fungus, or like a lichen or something like that. It would just lay on top of the ground. Providing that structure is cellulose and hemicellulose. So that's great from a plant standpoint. It gives it more access to sunlight. It gives it more ability to produce seed and to transmit that seed. All of those things are important, but that's what creates the difficulty in breaking it down. So cellulose and hemicellulose are those structural components that are difficult to break down. So bacteria and protozoa provide those fibrolytic enzymes to help break those down. There are also amylolytic bacteria that break down starch, so converting starches back down into simple sugars. So the big point of this, especially when we talk about ruminant animals, and to some extent hindgut fermenters like horses, but they have a symbiotic relationship, right? So when we think about nutrition and think about managing beef cattle, and to some extent, you almost have to think about it as two different entities. We have to think about trying to provide adequate nutrients for the rumen, for the microbes, for the fermentation vat, and then we also have to make sure we provide the right nutrients for the animal itself. So almost two different things, and that's that symbiotic relationship that's so unique to ruminant animals. So we think about the symbiotic relationship, it's positive for both species, right? It's positive for the bacteria and protozoa, and it's positive for the animal. It's positive for the bacteria and the protozoa because that animal is providing a stable environment for those bacteria and those protozoa, those populations to exist and even thrive, right? Because that animal is providing a constant flow of nutrients. Hopefully they're eating feed every single day. They have a constant temperature, and again, regulated by their body temperature. It's anaerobic, so we're removing air from it. It's a constant pH, a relatively constant pH. We provide a lot of moisture, a lot of water in there, and we constantly cycle that or circulate that and clean out that. So there's a constantly new nutrients coming in, a lot of the digestive food going out. So again, that's really unique environment that we're doing that. On the flip side, so we're providing a very unique, optimal environment for the bacteria and the protozoa. So it's symbiotic because it provides equally, the bacteria and protozoa provide the ability to break down those fibrous feeds, cellulose, hemicellulose, grasses, all of those types of things that would, for the most part, be unusable in cattle. It breaks them down into usable pieces that the animal can absorb and utilize. So that's that symbiotic relationship, right? So the bacteria break things down, structural carbohydrates, starches, and proteins down into basically volatile fatty acids, or VFAs. That's the major energy source that animal gets from that. Also amino acids. So we're breaking proteins down into the simple building block units, or amino acids. And we get B vitamins from the bacteria. So those are three ingredients that are very essential for ruminant animals, and that's how we get those animals. So another way to think about that is we get three volatile fatty acids. So if we think about glucose as a 6-carbon chain, this is even simpler than glucose. This is acetic acid, which is 2 carbons, propionic acid, which is 3 carbons, and butyric acid, which is 4 carbons. So we break them down into very usable building blocks, very usable pieces that can be utilized as energy by the animal. So the ruminant animal, the cow, the sheep, the goat, absorbs those VFAs, those fatty acids. They absorb through the membranes. They go into the bloodstream, and they're reconstructed into glucose and into other things. So the thing to think about, there's two sides to that, right? First of all is basically anything we can feed to that animal. I guess what I'm saying conservatively is a lot of things that we feed to that animal, regardless of how fancy and how crazy they are, basically whatever goes into the animal on the other end, what's going to ultimately be absorbed by the ruminant animal are VFAs, amino acids, typically microbial amino acids, and B vitamins, right? So anything that's extremely complex, anything that's extremely fancy is going to get broken down by the bacteria in the rumen, and it's going to be converted into VFAs, microbial protein, and B vitamins. So a lot of times we can feed something we think is going to have a big impact on that animal, and in all honesty, that animal is going to stay relatively consistent in what it actually absorbs and utilizes on the other end. All right, so that's ruminants to some extent. So we talked about the big fermentation. Once it goes to the rumen, the reticulum, and the omasum, it goes into the abomasum, or the true stomach, right? So that's where the gastric juices are excreted, including hydrochloric acid. We drop the pH very low. Those juices, those acids actually kill and digest the microbes that are passed on through. So the animal actually utilizes the VFAs and the microbes, the microbial protein there. So those bacteria, that animal basically gets a huge volume of bacteria that come through. They're very high in quality, very high in protein. That animal actually absorbs those as amino acids and utilizes those. So the abomasum is very much like a simple stomach in a monogastric species. Okay, now we're winding down here. I'm kind of narrowing up, but we want to kind of think about things big picture, right? So we talked about all of the differences between the monogastrics, the hindgut fermenters, the avian or bird species, and the ruminant animals. Those are kind of the 4 main categories. All of those things we kind of talked about. But what in general, what do they share to some extent, or what other parts or components are important from a digestive process. So if we think about it, the mouth and esophagus are important. So obviously chickens don't have that ability to break that down. That's where the gizzard comes in. But again, the chewing action of the mouth helps break that down mechanically, helps increase the surface area and allows more surface area for the microbes to attach and to break that product down. So chewing action is very important. Not only is the chewing and particle size important, but especially from a beef cattle standpoint, the chewing activity, whether it's in chewing the feed initially or through regurgitating and chewing cud, produces saliva. Saliva is very important to maintain the pH in the rumen and also provide some of those enzymes included in that saliva to help break things down. Salivary amylase and salivary maltase. So chewing is very important. Regurgitation is very important. That's why in a lot of the times when we see we're trying to fatten a beef steer, we want to include some hay, some type of roughage continually, even though we want a high grain diet to provide a lot of energy. A lot of times we've got to include some amount of roughage because of how important the chewing action is, how important saliva is as a buffer to keep the pH in the normal range in the rumen, and how important it is to produce that saliva for those specific enzymes. So we always provide some amount of roughage, even though it may be small. We need to provide some roughage to that animal. So enzymes are organic catalysts that help speed up the process. They're basically tools to break down those components into smaller parts. Salivary amylase and maltase are ways to break down sugars back down into glucose. So in a monogastric summit, so we go through esophagus. Okay, so whatever enzymes and everything there, once it hits that very low pH, very acidic stomach, then that's where things, and that's secreted through the glands near the stomach wall. So again, we have a very low pH, and that's where the acid stops the action of all of those enzymes. And now we switch to more of a chemical, an acidic type of a thing where we try and denature the proteins. Another method to try and reduce and break down that into usable pieces for the animal. Gastric juices also include pepsin, renin, and gastric lipase. Pepsin is how we break down proteins into an amino acid. So pepsins and those things. Renin is another one that helps break down milk, right? That's an enzyme that's important for the complex proteins in milk. So those things are part, and so important, those enzymatic activity as well as the muscular or the mechanical activity is important in the rumen wall as well. So everything's now pushed towards the small intestine. Those gastric juices acts on those solids and that remain in the stomach and help break down particle size. Again, so as we work through that, we have to have lipases that break down fats. We have to have pepsin or proteases that break down the proteins, and we have to have some way to break down those carbohydrates. And again, a lot of times, a lot of that's done by the bacteria in the rumen, but we have amylases, maltases, things that break down those complex sugars into glucose. All of those things are important. So the liquid part moves on down in the rumen. We talked about that rumination, chewing the cud. We've already kind of touched on that. On average, cattle chew their cud about 6 to 8 times per day. So this is, I think, kind of what I think is kind of unique about cattle. Cattle were evolved or adapted. Basically, they're a prey species, right? So if you think about how animals and species developed over the years, cattle were probably hunted by wolves, were hunted by other large predators. So their idea was to eat very rapidly, and once they knew they were safe, lay down and then do the digestion, right? So that's kind of the unique thing about cattle. They can eat very rapidly, put it all in the rumen, and then when they feel calm and when they feel safe, they can regurgitate that, re-chew it, remasticate it, and help break it down later on. So we know that's the mechanical part is also important, as well as the bacteria and the protozoa. We haven't talked a lot about the proteins, but again, we know that the building blocks of protein, amino acids make up those proteins, and we use a lot of that's whether it's enzymes and deaminases and proteases, whether it's from microbes on the protozoa or it's from the animal itself. We need to break those things down into amino acids so they can be transported across the intestinal wall and reabsorbed and then reconfigured into animal proteins within the animal. All right, small intestine, we talked about that. That's where most of the absorption takes place, right? So all of that feed, we've broken it down, we've exposed it to acids, we've deaminated, we've broken it down and moves into the small intestine. That's where hopefully we have it in small enough pieces to where it can be transported across the intestinal wall and absorbed. So that material that leaves the stomach and goes into the intestine is called chyme. And again, that's the liquid that includes the digestive juices, the feed particles, bile, all of those types of pancreatic juice, all of those things are in that chyme. So if we think about that, we got to break the proteins down. All of those things are broken down into amino acids. Sugar and maltose are broken down even further. They're changed into glucose. Lipases are included. Lipases work on fats in the food, changing them into fatty acids and glycerol, which can be absorbed through the rumen wall. All right, so all of that happens in the small intestine. That's where a majority of the absorption happens, is in the small intestine. All right, bile is part of that. Bile is stored in the gallbladder, except for in the horse. Bile aids in the digestion of fats and fatty acids. And so bile is an important part of that as well. And then some of the other glands are involved. Okay, so now we're down to, we'll talk a little bit about the large intestine or the cecum. So in horses, we have what we call a cecum or the blind gut. So that's where the small intestine joins the large intestine. So in us, I guess you can think about if you have an appendix. Appendix is basically, to some extent, a cecum. It's a blind pocket that it basically serves no function in humans, right? But it has developed significantly in horses. So that's basically, I guess, a similar structure in people, but in horses, it becomes that fermentation vat, right? That's where all of that fermentation happens. And so again, horses are opposite in that all of that moves through the simple stomach, the small intestine, and then it's actually fermented and broken down further in the large intestine or the cecum. All right, so we've talked about the main component, especially in ruminant species in the large intestine, is to try and reabsorb water. And it's important more in other species than others. So if you think about sheep are very efficient in removing water, more efficient than cattle, right? Because if you think about the pellets that come out of a sheep, they're considerably drier than the pellets that come out of, or not pellets, the patties, I guess, that come out of a cow, right? So again, sheep are very, very efficient at that, as well, removing that. So therefore, their water requirement, their water intake as a per pound of body weight is lower than cattle because they're more efficient in water use than cattle are. And goats to some extent as well. So again, large intestine is basically a way to reabsorb a lot of that water from that chyme or from that digestive that's flowing through. Okay, so we're basically at the end of it. We've got just a few minutes left. So we're going to do something that's kind of fun. Again, there's a quiz associated with this, but let's spend a little bit of time and think about some of the other species that are out there. So I don't know if you guys want to turn off your mute buttons and chime in if you want, but I think I got to get everybody back awake again. And so now you've got to help me out here. We're going to do just an informal quiz. We're going to go through some of the normal species, and you have to tell me, you have to guess. So you can text it too if you want. If you want to do that, that's possible as well. But you have to guess what type of animal, what type of digestive system these animals have. All right, so first one is pronghorn antelope. What type of digestive system do they have? Anybody want to chime in?
Anybody? Just take a guess.
This one's easy. I start you off easy.
Remnant?
Yep, good job. Yep, so the first one is, now I'm clicking on the wrong thing. So yep, they're a ruminant species. So that was an easy one. All right, we talked about this one already. What's this one? What's a rabbit?
A sequel?
Yep, cecal fermenter. Yep. Again, very, very good. Okay, deer.
Ruminant?
Yep. Oh, all right. A plus. Okay, now what's this one? This is a trick question. What is it, by the way? Hippo? So actually, a hippopotamus is a modified ruminant. So they actually have 3 compartments rather than 4. They are a ruminant animal, but they have 3 compartments rather than 4. All right. So how about a camel?
Ruminant?
Modified ruminant. Yep, they have 3 compartments rather than 4. Kangaroo, we talked a little bit about it. We call those sacculated stomachs. So again, it's not exactly a fermentation that happens, but they have an enlarged stomach that helps break down because they do tend to eat more plant-based products. They have to break it down. So hopefully none of you are showing kangaroos in your 4-H project, but that's what they have. All right, cattle, pretty easy, ruminant. We all know that. Horses, cecal fermenter, right? Okay, we're back on track again. What about this guy?
Monogastric?
Nope, he's a cecal fermenter just like a horse. So he's got the similar digestive system to a horse. How about this guy? He's a cecal fermenter just like a horse as well. All right. And finally, a giraffe.
Oh,
Somebody has to
guess.
guess them.
Yeah, somebody guess. Isabella, are you going to guess? I see you unmuted.
I'm guessing a monogastric.
He's actually a ruminant, has 4 compartments just like a goat or a sheep. So anyway, hopefully none of you are showing giraffes at the county fair, but it is kind of fun to think about how those different species evolved, maybe how they are similar or related to some of the domestic species that we think about or we utilize in our everyday environments. And you think about how it impacts what type of diets they eat, what type of foods that they eat. And so I think that's kind of fun, kind of interesting to think about when you walk through the zoo, looking at them, looking at their diet, looking at what they eat, and maybe how their digestive system relates to all of that. So with that, we're at about an hour, and I guess I've gone through all of my slides. Oh, I've got one more. Llama, which is a modified ruminant. They're like a camel. They're very closely related to camel, and they've got 3 compartments. So, all right, I think that's my last slide. I appreciate the chance to visit with everyone. Hopefully, I kind of held to my time slot, and if anybody's got any questions, I'm willing to stay online for a while, but that's the end of my talk.
All right, does anybody have questions? No questions. All right, well, just a reminder, I don't have the quiz posted yet for you guys, but I will get it posted so you can get the quiz taken for this lecture. Just a couple reminders, if you haven't taken the quizzes on those other lectures that you've done, by all means go back and get them taken care of. Allison, were you the one that had a question about the AI lecture? Are you there?
Yeah, I missed it, and then I went back on, and I cannot find it on WyoLearn. And I don't even have Module 12. I emailed Robin, and I don't even have Module 12 on my account. So
It's not like showing up. Okay.
Yeah, it's not there.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I went back and looked, and it is there, like it's on. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with that. So maybe one of you, the rest of you, I don't know, if somebody else could go back on WyoLearn and check and see if you guys can see the Module 12 and see that AI lecture, that would be super helpful.
I looked before and I couldn't find it either.
Really? So maybe it's just not showing up. Okay. I will go find out what's going. Maybe it's something that's not published or something. I'm not really sure what's going on with that. So I will go back and look on that. I'm glad. Thanks, Isabel, for checking on that. And I will go back and see why we can't get that brought up or what's going on with that. So other questions for Dr. Paisley before we wrap it up for tonight? All right, just a reminder, if you didn't get the harvesting lecture, it is next Tuesday. Some of you guys might have got it on the first round, but what happened was I couldn't get it to record on the computer, and so we didn't get an opportunity to record it, and so we are doing that again with Worry. Even if you were on the first time, you're welcome to join again. I think Worry's always entertaining and enjoyable to listen to, so that's 7 o'clock next Tuesday night. Just a couple other announcements is that if you guys went to the capstone weekend, I think what you learned tonight with Dr. Paisley's is super applicable. Steve, when we were at the capstone weekend, Worry harvested some animals with Kelsey, and that they actually took the pig digestive system and got to explore it and play with it and feel the muscles, and so that was really a cool cut it apart anyways. And so you guys that hopefully can connect what Steve has taught tonight with what you guys learned in that when we actually got to dissect that digestive system. So that was really cool. And then just a couple other announcements is that on June 4th, we are going to do a parasite Zoom that can be counted as a lab where Brooklyn Chamber from the State Vet Lab, you guys got to meet her if you were at the capstone weekend. If you didn't, she's going to be presenting a Zoom on parasites and parasites within a variety of species. She's got some samples that we're going to try to show across the camera, and so hopefully that will be helpful. But so with that, I'm done on announcements. Anybody has questions, concerns, you need help, anything going into the summer related to the animal science class or Dr. Paisley lecture?
Dawn?
Yes.
At the beginning you said to, like, in the chat box, put your county and your name and everything.
Oh, sure.
My chat box wasn't working.
Okay,
So.
I got you. So you're good.
Okay.
You've been on a million of them. So thanks, though, Tia. I appreciate that. So
Yeah.
I do have you down. So
Thank you.
yep. One thing connected to Isabel, this is for you, and then we are working on one in Goshen County, is that we are going to try to do some young producer days this summer, and I don't have those quite finalized, but working on them. But we are going to do one in Park County, which will be similar, kind of the capstone, if you guys went to the capstone, where it would be a day-long thing where you could get a variety of labs. I'm super excited. Jeremiah Barteman in Park County is going to help with that, as well as Tyce Moeller, Gretchen. And so those young producer days will be a day that you guys could come and get multiple labs done. So if there's some of the labs that you're struggling with to get enough done within your county, like, please shoot me a note if you think you could attend those young producer days, and we'll try to get some labs set up to help facilitate some of those learning opportunities as well, so that you can meet those requirements. As a reminder, you do have to have 2 labs within each of the 6 modules. So for example, in digestive, you get Dr. Paisley's lecture tonight, you take the quiz, and then you have 2 labs. So anyways, just a couple little sidekick reminders. But all right, with that, I'm finished. Dr. Paisley, Steve, do you have anything to add?
Got to unmute here. Nope. I think if you're comfortable with it, I'm happy to help out. And I guess if you get any questions by email or anything like that, just shoot them to me, and I'll be happy to do that.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for getting on. And Steve, we really, really appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts on the lecture. So with that, you guys each have a good night.